Welcome back to Fossil vs. Future. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we're going to talk about...
the ocean.
What about the ocean? Covering 70% of the Earth's surface and holding 97% of its water, the ocean is not just a vast body of water, it's the life support system for our planet. The ocean produces up to 80% of the oxygen we breathe, regulates global temperature, and drives weather patterns. It also acts as a crucial buffer against the worst impacts of climate change, having absorbed around 90% of the excess heat generated by greenhouse gas emissions and about a quarter of carbon dioxide emissions. Without the ocean, Earth's average surface temperature could be closer to 50 degrees C, not the 15 degrees C we know today. Economically, it's just as vital, contributing about $2.5 trillion annually to the global economy and supporting the livelihoods of millions who depend on fisheries, tourism, and marine resources. Protecting the ocean is essential for climate stability, marine biodiversity, food security, and the well-being of coastal populations. But this ecosystem, the largest on Earth, is under serious threat. The ocean now faces a triple crisis: overfishing, pollution, and climate change. Rising temperatures, acidification, and sea level rise are already reshaping marine ecosystems and threatening coastlines. Scientists warn that if warming continues unchecked, the ocean's ability to store carbon could collapse, turning it from a carbon sink into a carbon source. Coastal communities, home to over 680 million people today and more than 1 billion by 2050, are already feeling the impacts through sea level rise, ecosystem collapse, increasingly unstable fisheries, and damage to critical infrastructure. And yet, there is hope. Momentum is building for global action. At the recent UN Ocean Conference, nations rallied behind the High Seas Treaty, an ambitious effort to protect biodiversity in international waters, which lie beyond any single nation's control. To take effect, the treaty must be ratified by 60 countries. As the conference concluded, 50 had already ratified it, with dozens more pledging to do so by the end of 2025. But time is short, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
Years ago, when we first started working on climate change with the small island states, we wanted very much to highlight that the small island states are also large ocean states, in some cases covering huge areas of sea in the Pacific, for example. And it was quite hard to get the ocean onto the agenda. We quite recently had the Law of the Sea Convention, 1982. There was a strong sense that coastal states had new rights over quite large areas of sea, and they were focusing on that. It was just difficult to get climate and ocean to be connected. And frankly, it was ignored for a long period of time, and we had a lot of warning signs sent and a lot of talk perhaps about corals and the warming of oceans affecting the survival of coral reefs. And then there's a lot perhaps we could get across about the vulnerability of small islands, especially the coral-based islands, to sea level rise and storm surges. But still somehow it didn't really grip. And when my team and I were working with Fiji, when they were president of the climate negotiations, we made a big effort to try and highlight the oceans. And I think we made some progress there. And now, as you've set out, at last, we're starting to get more focus on the oceans in a sort of multi-dimensional way, of which climate is one seriously important part, but there are others too. And put more focus on the simply appalling pollution of the ocean environment, which of course has consequences in so many other ways, including obviously to us as humans when we consume and try and enjoy an ocean that's horribly polluted. But I'm also pleased that in the last few days, we've had more attention paid to the blue economy, ways of using the oceans productively and sustainably, finding solutions to other critical problems like climate change in the way in which we use the oceans. Lots of stuff we've talked about before in the alternatives to plastics coming from seaweed and other marine plants, but also the innovation that's going into how the marine environment could be used more productively, either to generate energy or to store it or to find ways of thinking constructively about what the oceans could do to deal with both economic and environmental problems. That was a positive aspect, I thought, of the ocean conference. And maybe one more last thing to mention was the fact that multilateralism hasn't entirely died,
Yes.
despite
Hooray.
all sorts of pressures against it. There was a genuine effort to reaffirm that one could put together countries in a room and figure out what they might be able to do collaboratively.
But this wasn't a negotiation type setup like you see at the COPs?
Well, there are still negotiations. They've still got to
Okay.
produce some kind of collective outcome. It may only be a communication, but there are lots of pledges to sign a legally binding treaty. So, yeah, no, there's a proper negotiations. And then don't forget the establishment of, for example, marine protected areas. That requires law, right? Those are legal regimes. And there are loads of pledges to add more areas of the sea under the protection of the law. Here in the UK, too, we pledged through our Secretary of State to increase the number of marine protected areas and also to cover difficult issues like dredging, trawler dredging of the ocean bed.
Well, at the moment, we're doing that in our protected areas.
I'm afraid we are, yeah. And it's still highly controversial. There are competing points of view, but it does look likely that dredging, certainly the most destructive form of bottom trawling, damages the ocean bed in a way which does destroy diversity of marine life and does hamper our ability to sequester carbon. There's counter-argument from the fishing industry that in most instances that isn't the case, but I mean, on balance, the evidence is pretty clear that the kind of dredging that is going on and has been going on for a while has been and continues to be damaging. And there's a way one could restore fisheries, help build back productive fisheries by stopping that kind of fishing.
Yeah, there's some really heartbreaking footage of bottom trawling in David Attenborough's new film, Ocean. It's shocking.
I think when people see, it is important, isn't it, to visualize. Most people have no real clue how fishing works. And we are immensely and ludicrously wasteful. We don't eat very many varieties of fish in this country. Other cuisines, other food cultures are more diverse than we are. We only really eat a limited range of fish, and so much is wasted. When a large catch comes through, there's a lot of fish that are either
thrown straight back into the sea.
And that feel that most people when they see that know that there's something wrong about that. Just as when they see marine pollution, they just know that's not good. That can't be right. Let's do something about that. I thought it was striking this week too, when there was a lot of attention paid to the ocean by prominent and charismatic figures like David Attenborough, but also our own Prince of Wales and other figures from other parts of the world that carry, if you like, cultural weight. That at the same time, there was a lot of coverage of Arnold Schwarzenegger really focusing on how to communicate the climate change issue and to galvanize effort, really trying to encourage people not to give up and, to be forthright in their arguments, but also to choose language which communicates well. And he was having, just like we've covered in previous episodes, sometimes our language doesn't connect with people. Whereas pollution of the ocean, we just know that. Don't do that. Right?
Yeah.
Let's stop that. And I think that it came across pretty clearly this week. And I'd like to think it's just one of those examples of a convergence of ideas at a time where there's a lot of pressure to not do collaborative things globally. I think last week was a pretty good week.
Yeah, the number of people, when I say that I work in climate change and sustainability, begin talking about not using plastic bottles or something to do with plastics in the ocean. Sometimes I find it a bit frustrating because I'm like, no, climate change is so much more than using a reusable bottle. But, maybe we should take We should, like
to
you say,
listen.
be taking advantage of the fact that that's obviously caught people's attention, and how can we raise awareness and educate using things like that, which are easier to grasp.
When people see dead zones in an environment which they know ought to be vibrant, and it really does cut through. I remember listening to Ellen MacArthur when she did her amazing round the world solo journey. That's what led to her starting her foundation, was just being out there on her own in the ocean and seeing for herself what was going on, and thinking that can't be right.
Now she does all the work on circular economy.
Must be something done about that. So how about I do it?
Very inspiring.
Very inspiring human.
Yes.
So that's something that this week has definitely told us, is that we are able to focus on a very, very big issue like ocean pollution and all the consequences associated with it, and combine complex issues, climate, pollution, economy, find some common understanding, set out some common aspirations, make some real commitments to change the law, find some money to incentivize. I mean, they're all marginal to some of the other forces that we're dealing with right now, but I think following on from our previous discussions on the role of law and populism in politics, and some of the really challenging issues like plastics, we can be pleased that this attention has now arrived at an issue. I don't think it'll go away. News items ebb and flow, and God knows there's plenty of other things to occupy our mind and our consciousness. But something about the long delay in proper attention being paid to this makes me feel more confident that we might have landed on something that we will work on properly together.
And in terms of the international law element, you mentioned the law of the sea, and my understanding is that established sort of, they call it economic zones, exclusive
economic zones, EEZs,
so 200 nautical miles from a country, which is the zone owned by that country.
It's an exclusive economic zone. It doesn't mean to say you've got no other obligations on how you use that quote unquote territory, because it's not the same as the 12-mile territory. So what the Law of the Sea Convention did is it agreed internationally to regulate via international law zones of the sea, to be clear about ancient rights of passage on the high seas, to figure out how ocean territory could be organized, including things like what to do with when islands are in an archipelago, where do we draw the lines? And a lot of that is to do with territorial disputes, boundary disputes, contests over resources. Could be fisheries, could also be oil, could be minerals, and to find some kind of agreed legal order that would enable people to peacefully use the oceans. And so here we have, and that was 1982, and it took quite a long time for that to enter into force. And there are gaps. There were things that were never fully resolved.
And not every country ratified it either,
not every country ratified it, as is
often
pretty much always the case. Right? So you have and as you remember Philippe Sands saying, there's a tribunal in Hamburg that settles disputes, and that's better than other forms of settling disputes, with force. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't deal with every possible issue, and there are still other big disputes over ocean territories and boundaries and where to draw them. And most of those cases finish up at the International Court rather than the one in Hamburg. And they don't always get resolved. But on the whole, there's a pretty good record of resolving disputes through the law of the sea. And now we've got sort of a next generation lawmaking process to cover some of those gaps and to introduce some of the issues that we've talked about many times, which perhaps were not given sufficient attention in the past, but now matter more, and biodiversity. We also had treaties involving how oceans function from a biodiversity or species point of view. So we've had agreements on migratory species, for example, knowing that some critical species covered their territories crossed our political boundaries or move between them, if you're following the migration of whales, for example. So, yeah, we have done a reasonable job of applying the law to these spaces, but not a good enough one, shall we say.
I think 2/3 of the ocean is classed as international waters.
High seas, yeah.
High seas,
beyond anybody's jurisdiction.
And so if we are to meet commitments like the 2022 biodiversity commitment, 30 by 30, so protecting 30% of our land and oceans by 2030, we need to get those international waters involved in some way, hence why this high seas treaty has come about.
And we've long tracked the abuse of the gaps, the what goes on in the high seas, whether it's crime or drift net fishing or scientific whaling we talked about before. Unfortunately, states take advantage of gaps in the legal regimes, and they just always have done and probably always will do, and so you've got to do your best. One of the things that we found post-Law of the Sea Convention, and actually some other international agreements that related to the environment, is that enforceability was tough because you need resources to enforce large ocean areas. You can imagine small island states, big ocean states, just don't have the resources to manage those areas. And so other more wealthy, more powerful states with big long-range fishing fleets, for example, no, they'll get away with it if they go into areas which are not adequately monitored.
Well, deep sea mining is probably going to be one of those things. So President Trump signed an executive order in April to allow deep sea mining in international waters.
Yeah, I know, it's classic, isn't it?
Which some countries are saying is breaking international law. I think that's yet to...
Funny enough, that was a feature of the 1982 conference.
Deep sea mining?
Yeah, it was all to do with manganese nodules.
Yes, I was reading about them.
They were discussed back then. So
polymetallic nodules.
Yeah, so it's not a new thing. Right? It is a classic example. I just want that, so I'm going to have that. That's the kind of tone of voice you get from Donald Trump. But the issue of whether or not you can effectively mine the ocean is still open. I mean, there may well be examples of responsible or effective mining of the ocean bed. I'm open-minded about it, but what it can't be is unregulated. Right?
Yeah.
So if there is opportunity to, let's face it, we've had an episode on minerals. We know how important minerals are going to be to the energy transition. Who knows? There may well be. I remain open-minded that could be a very interesting source of minerals. And after all, we're having discussions about going to the outer space to get minerals. So you might as well look at the ocean we've already got. But the idea that it's just sort of open season is ridiculous. You've got to be regulated in the same way as mining is on land. And there may not be a way of doing it safely. There may not be a way of managing an ocean resource sustainably. At the very least, if those resources are there, and it looks like they are, and they are accessible, and in some parts of the world they are to modern equipment, then let's sit down carefully and think through how that resource could be exploited without causing harm. And I would, partly because I worked on it so many years ago, and I still believe that would be one of those occasions where the precautionary principle should apply.
I was going to say, surely.
Yeah,
I think 2,000 scientists have come out and just said, pause on this. We can't rush into this.
Go very, very carefully.
It's something like 0.0... Is it 0.001 or 0.01% of the deep sea floor is discovered?
We know virtually nothing.
We probably know more about planets in space than we do about...
Almost certainly more about the moon anyway.
Than we do about the deep sea. And I was reading about dark oxygen as well. Have you heard about dark oxygen? So scientists think that these nodules, these nodules are essentially little potato-shaped things at the bottom of the sea
They are quite pretty much as they describe. Yeah, the word's quite useful.
Minerals.
Yeah.
They have found oxygen in areas of the sea which it'd be far too dark to have photosynthesis. So they believe these nodules might be producing oxygen. So if we start mining these, we're going to affect one of our oxygen sources.
What are we going to do to the...
Yeah, it's just all so unknown. I think it's quite scary. So I definitely agree with the precautionary principle here.
I mean, just as a reminder, the precautionary principle doesn't say you can't do anything that might be novel or experimental or a frontier in science or engineering or commerce. It just says that where there's risk of serious or irreversible harm, then you don't wait for the full scientific proof of that harm having happened.
Yeah.
You act in a precautionary manner. You take the evidence, again, just to be clear, the precautionary principle does not operate in a space without evidence. It takes the evidence that is available at a particular time and says, given that and given the risks associated with the pursuit of this particular enterprise, we will act in a precautionary manner and we will prevent that harm from happening. And it does involve a reversal of the burden of proof. Right? It then says, in those limited circumstances, i.e. serious or irreversible harm, then the burden shifts to those who want to carry out that activity to show that it's not going to cause that harm that is feared or risked. And that's difficult to do, right? It's difficult to do, but it's supposed to be. So that's the context. The precautionary principle is not a do-nothing. It doesn't happen in the absence of evidence. It's not just because I don't like something or I don't like you. It's a requirement to satisfy a burden, demonstrate that this intervention in the natural environment is acceptable because, and it passes a very difficult burden. So I would apply it in this circumstance.
Yeah. I think so.
And the other thing it's telling us, and you touch upon it, is just how much we don't know about these systems. And then every now and again, the learning produces something rather wonderful. So, as you know, I spent years working on wildlife law and whale and dolphin conservation. I used to do the International Whaling Convention work with NGOs like the Environmental Investigation Agency and whale and dolphin conservation. I actually loved working with those people. They're some of the most brilliant marine scientists, and they were just so impressive what they knew and how they organized themselves. And I was honored, frankly, to work with them. And years ago, we did, I think, establish the connection between the conservation of marine life and climate change in quite an effective way. And I think we did good work to bring to the International Whaling Commission and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and other of the legal regimes an awareness that climate change was going to be a factor in the populations as they're still described of whales and dolphins, likewise with marine pollution of protected areas and even establishing protected areas, which we did, I think, quite successfully in Antarctica. But what we hadn't really understood then and do now is the part that particularly the big whales, the really big species, play in ocean circulation and in the sequestration of carbon. And this is such a lovely notion to me, partly because of my admiration for these extraordinary animals. It's the service that they're providing to us just by being in the ocean ecosystem, the way they behave, the way they come to the surface and circulate vital nutrients, but also sequester CO2 in the oceans. So this beautifully simple idea that more whales is good for the sequestering of carbon in the oceans, I just love that.
Such a nice example of how connected everything is.
Yeah, it's a very strong example of that. And also that by studying, by really knowing, by researching and understanding the real world, by observing other species, then we can figure out ways of living better and sorting out some of our own problems. I just like that idea of the vital properties of whale poo. It's good, isn't it? And the what's magnificent about a great whale being also the physical properties of them, being that powerful an animal that they could actually do something to help us.
I don't think I've ever had that feeling so much of we must protect our Earth as I did when I saw a humpback whale in Colombia. I was, so lucky to see them, but it's just...
It is amazing the physical effect it has on you. Yeah. I have been fortunate enough to be close by big whales. It's not something you can just think about. It is felt. And why would that be the case? It's not just because of what I do. It really isn't. It's a connection. My particular experience came, perhaps most, I've been lucky to have more than one, but one that really hit home was in Patagonia. My friend Pedro Tarak took some of us out. There's a place called Puerto Madryn in Patagonia where particularly mothers and calves come. It's almost like a resting bay. It's a very interesting shaped double bay, actually, with a foreshore that they come up and they basically scratch themselves on the beach. Maybe they might be removing barnacles. I don't know. But if you really wanted to, you could, run out and jump on the back if you wanted to. But equally, they feel relaxed in that area, which perhaps is surprising since they're mothers and calves. They're not stressed, and so you can with a go out in a small boat, and you could reach down and touch something that close. But when they come alongside, it is physically moving. And certainly if they do any displays like humpbacks do, it's a tremendous thing. And they're learning more about those behaviors, like the circling with humpbacks that will produce a circle of bubbles.
Okay.
And there may well be some form of communication specifically for us. I don't know. I mean, that's certainly the current thinking is that maybe there's whale song, but there's also some other ways of communicating that might be able to sort of cross over between species. I mean, I find that interesting. But anyway, but back to the climate question, the fact that there may be a service provided by these extraordinary creatures. If only we looked after them better, or get out of their way. Just make sure that they're not hunted. Or obviously there are loads of things that we do in the ocean that affect their migratory paths, but it is a wondrous sight for sure, and it's a more than intellectual feeling that you have when you're in their presence.
Taking away anything from the sea is just going to completely disrupt the food webs and even though whales have such a key role, because of that chain, you take one thing away or lose one species, and it will have all these knock-on effects on.
Yeah, the one that's really obvious in this context is krill and acidification of the oceans, which we are measuring now, and it really is a serious.
Yeah, because by absorbing the carbon dioxide, the oceans are becoming more.
They're more acid,
more acidic.
and it's affecting the main source of food for whales and other species, but krill are vital. And a warming ocean, it's acidification and warming. It's the combination.
Yeah.
Neither are good.
And that was interesting to me, the fact that the warming of the ocean is what is the main contributor to sea level rise. Yeah. I had thought that it was related more to melting ice, raising sea levels, but actually it's as the oceans are warming and the water molecules are moving further apart, that's the main contributor to.
Thermal expansion is more important. They will contribute. They will have a different effect in different parts of the planet. And then there's all the stuff we've touched upon perhaps before about ocean currents and the effect of cold water runoff, particularly in the northern Atlantic. Those are all going to be disruptive, and it's a highly complex system.
It's quite overwhelming.
It is a bit, but I think in essence the focus on the oceans from a climate point of view is going to be a good thing to do with real effort, with resources, with sensibly, cooperatively worked out international legal arrangements, with rising awareness around the world, finding better ways of communicating for sure. Schwarzenegger's probably right that the concept of pollution communicates better than many others that we use. But one way or another, finding the time and the resources to really make the oceans more resilient to climate change, but also drawing upon them in order to fix the problem would be time very much worth spent. And it does also help us figure out, again, as if we needed it, but perhaps we do still, how interconnected we all are. I mean, it's very obvious when you look at the water body itself. And anyway.
Yeah, I think an example of one of those statistics that really gets people is that there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. I think that's one of the really depressing ones that is hard to forget.
Yeah, and it's possible that this conversation is maybe more particular to us living in an island. Don't have the same feeling about the ocean if you're in a landlocked country. The big systems that drive the planet as a whole are utterly dependent, as your introduction says, on the ocean. And although so much of our history and the economy built on trade and exploration has involved crossing ocean to somewhere else, land, the great prize is the arrival rather than the journey. I still think it's deep. It's well within the imagination of pretty much every human that the ocean matters to them, and despoiling it, taking it for granted, or actively destroying it thoughtlessly, we know that's not right. And we deep down we know it's probably something we can do about it if we behave differently, if we value things differently. And my sense is that we have to use all of the human ingenuity that we have, whether it's philosophical, scientific, storytelling, great stories about the sea, or it's innovation, clever technology, or new ways of valuing economically the ocean. All of it, all needs to be done. And it's a pretty good mission.
Definitely. There are things you can do as an individual, I guess, like thinking about what fish you eat and eating. I think all certifications have their pros and cons. They all have their limits,
but it is something you can do. You can look for, I don't know what the range is now. Certainly the Marine Stewardship Council was one that I remember working with a long time ago. And supermarkets are quite conscious of this. They know quite a lot about where everything comes from, and you can make consumer choices that are good or bad. And let's hope some of the alternatives to plastics do gain strength. It's a really difficult challenge, as we've talked about before. Just the size of the amount of plastics we use, the industry behind it is incredibly difficult to replace. Mm-hmm. But substitution is beginning the margins, isn't it?
Yep. And recycling's not perfect.
No,
but
it really isn't. And the numbers are tiny, but
it's better than
also
ending
helps,
up in the ocean.
Yeah. And we're not short of things that we can do. And we probably do need a sharp reminder of how much. This might be one of those cases where we can communicate something visual or something that resonates beyond the facts, because sadly we know that doesn't do it.
Well, I think David Attenborough's done an incredible job of communicating.
He's pretty damn good at communicating, yeah. Well, thank you very much, David Attenborough, and all the others that have stood on a platform recently to draw attention to the issue.
Yeah, and fingers crossed that we can protect 30% of our oceans by 2030.
Honestly, if we can, that will have multiple benefits. That will not just be a climate benefit. Because we know that the oceans restore fast if they're allowed to. There are some pretty remarkable stories already of the value of allowing areas to restore themselves.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil vs. Future. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a rating. Follow us on social media and send us the what about questions you'd like us to discuss.